Alright guys, let's go for round 2 for personality, talking about trait theory. I promised you in our first set of video notes for this unit that the remaining videos would not be very long, and I definitely want to keep myself to that because I know that having to sit there and listen to me for 40 minutes in a video can be a little bit overwhelming. So let's try to make this as brief as possible and still get across the main points that you need to know. For trait perspective, we define a trait as any tendency that you have to respond in a particular way, regardless of the situation in many respects, okay? So when we talk about things, you'll hear me make reference to extraversion an awful lot in this video, okay? Being extroverted means you are outgoing, talkative. You get a lot of energy from being around lots of people. You are sociable in many respects, okay? Here's the thing. That extroversion will present itself regardless of the situation, whether you're, in a room with a whole bunch of strangers or whether you're in a room with a whole bunch of people that you know at a party. You're still going to demonstrate those extroverted characteristics regardless of the situation. Trait theorists believe that every one of us falls on some spectrum or some end of a trait. Excuse me. So we all have traits that apply to us in some way, and every one of those traits can be measured. Okay, so we fall somewhere in regards to an assessment of a particular trait. It is somehow present in us in some way and can be easily measured, okay? So what trait theorists are also going to do is take a look at the theories along the lines of what kind of behaviors are going to go together with one another. So what are you going to see in terms of, not only extroverted tendencies, but what other things go along with extroversion? Are extroverts more impulsive, for example? So at that end component, would they be at the lesser end of a conscientiousness spectrum? Are they going to be individuals who are more open to experience, which is another of the big 5 traits you'll hear me talk about later? So that's just something to consider moving forward. So one of the first theorists you want to take a look at for trait theory is Gordon Allport. He looked at personality in terms of fundamental traits, okay? So patterns to our behavior put down into 3 categories, basically, 3 types of traits. You've got a cardinal trait, you have a central trait, and then you have a secondary trait. So let's talk about each one of them, all right? Cardinal traits, this is the characteristic or feature that is so present in a person, or so important, so prevalent, that that person is identified by it, right? So Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, for example, he is very stingy and cold-hearted. Like that's his cardinal trait, is that stingy factor, right? I mean, so much so that being a Scrooge is used as a descriptor for things. Okay, so just to give a lot of a level of clarification to things. A lot of students would argue a lot when I do this activity in class with kids, especially when I'm teaching it at intro. I'll say, what do you think my cardinal trait is, to try to get kids to find the connection for themselves. And it's pretty hilarious when you hear what a lot of students perceive, because what seems to be the most common thing put out there for me is sarcastic and loud. And so we're going to talk about this as we get through the remainder of this stuff, but one of the biggest downsides to trait theory is that it fails to recognize the impact of situations. The reality is, yes, I am going to be loud because I'm a teacher, and I have plenty of students who have hearing deficiencies, but not only that, I've said this to you on numerous occasions. You don't want to sit there and listen to a monotone person talk to you guys about these concepts and stuff. Many of you don't even want to be sitting there listening to me as I present this information to you right now with lots of hand gestures and intonations and all of that jazz. But at any rate, that's what a lot of students would give in terms of my cardinal trait. My family wouldn't necessarily perceive it that way, but that's one of the downsides we'll talk about a little bit later. In terms of a central trait, these are things that make us predictable in the vast majority of situations, right? So, if you say he's shy, then it's going to be pretty predictable then that individual is going to be quite quiet with you. They're not going to initiate conversation in many respects. And then there's other behaviors, obviously, that could be predicted in terms of value for that too. And then you get secondary traits. These, Allport believed, were the least significant of all 3. These are things that convey things about what make us who we are, but they're preferences that are really easily changeable. So like, food that you like, music you listen to, how you dress. Those are things that he would consider to be kind of secondary. So your preference of liking country music over rap or vice versa. Now, Ray Cattell, on the other hand, is another trait theorist who took a look at using factor analysis, which are statistical data pieces, to identify 6 personality factors that he thought were kind of, the whole package, so to speak. So everybody has the same 16 characteristics, just to varying different degrees, okay? And so Cattell's 16 factor theory is another one out there within the trait field. You will be able to complete a 16 factor theory test with me in class to kind of see where you fall for things. And then you have Hans Eysenck, who is one of the big guys at the forefront. Both he, his wife Sybil, even his son Michael, all 3 of them kind of worked together in many respects to evaluate the significance of personality. And so Hans Eysenck assessed 2 basic dimensions to your personality. So we're going to kind of flip to another theory on personality. You're going to see as we move through these, there's obviously varying degrees along these spectrums, which is ultimately how we get the development of the big 5. But you have 2 basic dimensions to your personality based off of some aspect of continuum and where you fall. You have extraversion, opposite end is introversion, and then you have emotional stability, opposite is instability. So extroverted, as I said, is sociable, outgoing, active, lively. You're very talkative. Introversion is one who tends to be more thoughtful, okay, in the sense that they think first, act later. They evaluate and they analyze things in their head. Extroverts tend to act first and think later. Introverts are more reserved, more quiet, more shy, more cautious, okay? And so ultimately those find and lend themselves for different demonstrations of personality. You could be right smack in the middle if you wanted to. And it's also possible to be something that we call an extroverted introvert and an introverted extrovert. We'll talk about all of this with the big 5 when you guys do a practice test for me. Emotional stability is that you are easygoing. If you think back to some of the stuff that we learned about in Unit 8, that whole type B personality of someone who is just very relaxed, very chill, very go with the flow style personality, that is what you're going to get at that emotional stability end of things. They're very well adjusted and even tempered. If things don't go the way that they expect them to, they're not going to freak out and just blow up, okay? The emotionally unstable end would be what we would categorize then as the type A, kind of the opposite, okay? So they tend to be a little bit more moody and anxious and restless. If things don't go according to plan, it will throw them completely off and they will absolutely freak out. So here's Eysenck and his wife Sybil. This is the continuum, the spectrum that they created. So here is your emotional stability line. At the unstable end, that term was referenced as neuroticism or being neurotic. You'll hear it termed that way in the big 5 in a little bit. And then you have the extroverted versus introverted line. And so ultimately, it was possible for you to fall in to any number of these quadrants based off of some of the behaviors that you demonstrated, okay? So you've heard me make reference to the big 5. Let's talk about it to kind of wrap all this stuff up, okay? This is some slightly expanded factors that are currently what trait theorists believe are the best approximations of the dimensions out there for people's personality traits, okay? So this is not created by any one singular theorist. There are many people who contributed to it, lots of compilations of work. You will hear Eysenck's content in here, but it's also an awful lot of other people who have contributed as well. And then ultimately, just as was the case with Eysenck's stuff, a person will fall based off of a continuum, okay? So let's talk about the big 5. Number 1, you've got emotional stability. I'm not going to spend a ton of time rehashing this just because we literally just got done talking about it, and I want to try to keep this as brief for you as possible, given that you gave me so much patience for our first set of notes. So, is an individual, when they are presented with certain things in their life, relatively capable of responding in an easygoing manner or without getting upset, or are they at the opposite end, which is that neuroticism or the emotional instability component, okay? Are they constantly angry and worried or complaining all the time, or do they look for the bad rather than the good, okay? So, put another way, emotional stability is more of that optimist, glass half full. Neuroticism is more of that glass half empty, kind of pessimistic viewpoint. Then you have extraversion, okay? This is with being, associated with energy, talkativeness, sociability there, okay? Opposite is introversion, so quiet, shy, cautious. Again, not going to spend a ton of time focusing on that just because we just got done talking about it. So let's move into the third of the big 5 traits, which is agreeableness, okay? This is your capacity for sympathy for others, being cooperative with others, being kind, trusting, good-natured. People feel like they can come to you, okay, that you're going to be there for them in terms of a support. The opposite of that is what we would call antagonism, okay? Somebody who is very abrasive, who rubs people the wrong way, highly irritable. They are that person that is just jealous of everybody else for having everything that they do not, okay? Constantly suspicious, there we go, of others and anything that is good that happens to them, okay? So agreeableness is more along the lines of someone who's pleasant to be around. Antagonism is not so much. If you look at it in terms of how you were taught about the antagonist in literature, how they are the opposition, the blocking point to the protagonist, which is your hero. A lot of times the antagonist is the bad guy. That can kind of help make it a little bit easier to remember the spectrum there as well. Then you've got openness to experience, okay? So these are people who are incredibly open-minded. They're willing to try new things, new intellectual experiences, new ideas, new foods, all of that kind of stuff. These are the people that are just like, yeah, skydiving, let's go do it. Just because they just want to experience what that new possibility could open up for them, okay? The opposite of this is resistance to new experience. These individuals like predictability, okay? They like everything just so in terms of expectations and what to anticipate coming down the pike. In some respects, they are conforming and unimaginative just because, they don't like looking outside of the box. They like their box. It's good for them. It works. And so they just like to keep, trucking on down the line in that respect. And then the fifth of the big 5 traits is conscientiousness. So are you somebody who is going to see a task through? Are you dutiful, dedicated, organized, responsible? Okay. Do people feel like they can come to you and ask you to complete something because ultimately they know you will and you are reliable? Or are you at the other end, which is the impulsiveness end of things? Okay. These are when you tend to be pretty careless. No one comes to you to do something because they know you'll start it, but you're never going to finish it. You're not dutiful, you're not dedicated because you're highly irresponsible and you'll start something but never follow through on it and finish it up. Okay, so all of us can fall in any number of ways on any of these spectrums, which is ultimately why I love doing these activities in class with you guys, because you get a chance to be able to see kind of where you fall and what your personality demonstrates on these continuums. So we'll do that stuff and see where you fall in class with one another. Let's talk about how it is that they attempt to assess all of these traits that they claim are measurable, okay? What they're going to do is personality inventories. Most of these are going to be questionnaires where you respond to any number of a variety of items and thoughts and beliefs and all of that other stuff. The most common one, the most widely used, is the MMPI-2. This is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Fun little fact here. It was developed to identify abnormal personality tendencies. So it was actually used to try to help take a look at disordered individuals. And so what they try to do is they score you objectively based off of the continuum that you assign to things, okay? We don't do an MMPI-2 in class with one another. We typically just hold it to the big 5 trait test, simply just for time purposes. But I will be giving you guys a couple of links in class if you're interested to be able to do an MMPI-2, so that way you can kind of see where you fall. One last piece to this is very important to recognize. Just because something is scored objectively, that doesn't mean that it is still valid, okay? And so that's an ultimate downside to trait theory in that regard, because we don't take a look at it to see, that it yields, constantly consistent results across the board all the time. Because the reality is, some people have learned how to fool the test, especially if they're individuals like sociopaths or psychopaths who try to present certain aspects of their personality that are not, in fact, real. And the other thing to keep in mind, as I shared with you guys before, the reality is sometimes our personality does change when it comes to situations. You guys have demonstrated that on numerous occasions. Many of you are extroverted. However, you're incredibly quiet in my class because that's what you've been taught via the situation. That you're supposed to be passive listeners. in class where a teacher talks at you and things along those lines. And the reality is sometimes situations make it so that way people don't act in predictable ways. So it's important to recognize that as a pretty big downside to trait theory.